I refuse to give my lottery winnings to my family for this reason. I come from a family of five: my parents, my two siblings, and me. Growing up, I was always the black sheep. My siblings were the golden children, straight A students, star athletes, the kind of kids every parent would brag about. I wasn't bad, my grades were decent, I stayed out of trouble, and I even had a knack for art that my teachers often praised. But for some reason, my parents never seemed to see any of that. It wasn't outright neglect, but it was the little things. Fewer hugs, less enthusiasm at parent-teacher conferences, and more criticism when I made even the smallest mistake. My siblings, Emma and Jake, thrived under the spotlight. Emma always had my mom's attention: shopping trips, weekend brunches, and endless mother-daughter bonding. Jake was my dad's pride and joy. They spent hours together working on his car, going to games, or just talking about life. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, often left to my own devices. I taught myself how to draw because art class wasn't enough. I would sit in my room for hours, sketching, while the rest of the family watched movies or played board games without me. It wasn't just at home either. School events were another reminder of how invisible I was. At Emma's dance recitals or Jake's soccer matches, the entire family would show up, decked out in school colors or holding flowers. For my art exhibitions or smaller events, there was always an excuse: work ran late, they were tired, or they simply forgot. I got used to it, but it didn't make it hurt any less. A few months ago, my family planned a big overseas trip. I found out about it through Instagram. I was scrolling through my feed when I saw Emma's post, a photo of her boarding a plane, captioned, "Family adventure begins." My stomach dropped. I waited for a call or text, thinking maybe there had been a mistake. Nothing came. After a few days of silence, I caved and called my mom. Her voice was casual, almost dismissive. "Oh, we didn't think you'd want to come," she said, as if that explained everything. "And besides, we're tight on budget." Tight on budget? I thought about the countless times they had gone out to eat without me, the new car Jake got for his 21st birthday, and now this extravagant trip. The word stung, but I swallowed my pride and let it go. I was used to being an afterthought. Fast forward to a month ago. I bought a lottery ticket on a whim. I wasn't expecting to win. It was just one of those spur-of-the-moment decisions you make when life feels particularly dull. But when I checked the numbers later that night, I couldn't believe my eyes. I had won, not just a couple $100 or $1,000, but a life-changing amount, over $2 million. For a while, I just sat there staring at the ticket, trying to process what it meant. My mind raced with possibilities: pay off my student loans, buy a house, travel the world. The money felt like a second chance, an opportunity to rewrite my story. I decided to be smart about it. I met with a financial advisor, paid off my debts, and invested a large portion of it. I set aside a smaller amount for fun, nothing too flashy, just enough to finally treat myself. I didn't tell my family right away. I wanted to enjoy the feeling without any added drama. But keeping it a secret became harder after I bought a new car. It wasn't extravagant, a sleek, mid-range model that I had always admired, but it was enough to draw attention. Emma noticed it first. She cornered me at a family gathering, her tone dripping with curiosity. "Nice ride," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Where'd you get the money for that?" The news spread quickly after that. Within days, my phone was flooded with calls and messages. My mom's voice on the other end of the line was sharp. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Did you really win the lottery?" When I confirmed it, her tone shifted. "Why didn't you tell us? We're family. We could have celebrated together." Celebrated together. The irony wasn't lost on me. Where was this sense of unity when they planned a family vacation without me? Or when I spent birthdays blowing out candles alone because they were too busy? Well, I held my tongue. "I just wanted to keep it low-key," I said. "It's not a big deal." Apparently, it was a big deal to them, at least. My sister started dropping hints about her student loans. "It's just so hard, you know? I'm drowning in debt," she said one evening, her voice heavy with exaggeration. My brother was less subtle. "You could buy me a house," he said, half joking, but with a gleam of expectation in his eyes. Even my mom chimed in. "You know, your dad and I could really use some help with the mortgage. It's what family does." I finally snapped. "Family? You mean the same family that left me out of a trip because you assumed I wouldn't want to come? The same family that's treated me like an afterthought my entire life? I'm not obligated to share my money just because we're related." The room fell silent. My dad's face turned red. "That was different," he said, his voice tight. "This is family money. You wouldn't have one without us. Family money." The phrase hung in the air like a bad smell. I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest. "No," I said firmly. "It's my money. I bought the ticket. I took the chance, and I'm not going to let you guilt me into giving it away." Since then, the phone calls have been relentless. My mom leaves voicemails accusing me of being selfish. Emma posts passive-aggressive comments on social media about family loyalty. Jake texts me lists of things he needs as if I'm his personal ATM. They've even started reaching out to extended relatives, painting me as the ungrateful brat who's tearing the family apart. At first, I doubted myself. Was I being selfish? Was I wrong for standing my ground? But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about money, it was about respect. For years, I had been the afterthought, the expendable one. Now, suddenly, I was valuable because I had something they wanted. It's a strange feeling being wanted for all the wrong reasons. I've started to notice how much lighter I feel when I'm not around them. There's a freedom in finally putting myself first and not bending over backward to earn their approval. Still, the guilt lingers, a shadow I can't quite shake. Even now, as I sit here writing this, the phone buzzes with another message. I glance at it, hesitating. Another plea? Another guilt trip? I let it ring, the sound fading into the background. Maybe one day they'll understand. Or maybe they won't. Either way, for the first time in my life, I'm learning to choose myself. A week after the last family gathering, I decided to take a step back from the chaos. I turned off notifications for our family group chat and started spending more time alone, trying to find a sense of normalcy in this whirlwind of sudden wealth and family drama. My apartment, which had always felt small and cluttered, was starting to feel like a sanctuary. It wasn't about the size or the things in it. It was the quiet. For the first time, I started thinking about what I wanted out of life. Not just in the vague, wishful way I used to when imagining escaping my family's shadow, but in concrete terms. Where did I want to live? What did I want to do? The possibilities felt endless, but also overwhelming. The money had freed me from immediate financial worries, but it hadn't answered the deeper questions that had lingered for years. Who was I without their criticism? What did I actually like, not just tolerate because it was convenient or expected? It was during one of those reflective moments that my phone rang. It was Emma. I almost didn't pick up, but something made me answer. Her voice was unusually soft, almost hesitant. "Hey," she said. I wanted to talk. I didn't know what to expect. Apologies weren't exactly Emma's strong suit, and I braced myself for another round of guilt tripping. But instead, she started talking about her own struggles. "You know," she said, "I always envied you. You were so independent, so comfortable being alone. I felt like I had to be perfect all the time just to get mom and dad to notice me. And even then, it never felt like enough." Her words caught me off guard. Emma envying me? It was hard to reconcile with the image I had of her as the golden child, the one who had it all together. But as she talked, I started to see cracks in that image. She confessed that she had been struggling with anxiety for years, hiding it behind her achievements because she didn't want to disappoint anyone. "I know we haven't always been fair to you," she said finally, "and I'm sorry for that. I guess I didn't know how to handle my own stuff, let alone be a good sister." It was a lot to take in. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her it was too little, too late. But another part of me, the part that had spent years yearning for some kind of connection, couldn't ignore the vulnerability in her voice. We talked for hours that night, more openly than we ever had before. She didn't ask for money, and I didn't offer. It wasn't about that, not this time. By the end of the call, I felt something I hadn't expected, a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But hope is a fragile thing, and the rest of the family wasn't exactly following Emma's lead. The next day, I got an email from my mom. It was long and meticulously written, the kind of message that had obviously been drafted and revised multiple times. She laid out in excruciating detail the ways in which she believed I owed the family. She referenced birthdays I'd forgotten, chores I hadn't done as a teenager, even that one time I'd borrowed her car and brought it back with an empty tank. "It's not about the money," she wrote at one point, a line so laughable I nearly choked on my coffee. "It's about the principle. Family supports family, and right now, we need your support." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't even sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to unleash years of pent-up frustration, to call her out for her blatant favoritism and hypocrisy. But another part of me knew it wouldn't make a difference. She wasn't looking for a conversation, she was looking for compliance. Instead, I forwarded the email to Emma. "Is this what you meant about her expectations?" I asked. Her reply came quickly. "Yep, welcome to my world." It was strange, finding solidarity with someone I had always seen as an adversary. Emma and I started texting more after that. Not about the money or the family drama, but about other things, books we were reading, shows we were watching, memories from when we were kids. For the first time, I felt like I had a real sibling, someone who saw me as more than just the black sheep. But Jake was another story. If Emma's approach was to reflect and apologize, his was to double down. He started showing up unannounced at my apartment, each visit more aggressive than the last. "You can't just cut us off," he said during one particularly heated argument. "We're family. That means something." I didn't bother pointing out the irony of his statement. Instead, I told him firmly that my boundaries weren't up for debate. "I'm not cutting anyone off," I said. "I'm just not letting you dictate how I spend my money." He scoffed. "You've changed," he said, as if it were the worst insult he could think of. And maybe, I add, maybe winning the lottery had changed me. But it wasn't the money, it was the clarity. For the first time, I could see the dynamics of my family for what they really were, without the fog of guilt and obligation clouding my judgment. The weeks that followed were a mix of highs and lows. On one hand, I was starting to build a life that felt authentically mine. I signed up for an art class, something I hadn't done since high school. I started planning a solo trip, the kind of adventure I used to dream about but never thought I could afford. On the other hand, the tension with my family was reaching a breaking point. My dad, who had always been the quiet one, finally weighed in during a family video call. "You're tearing this family apart," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. I wanted to tell him that the family had been fractured long before I won the lottery, but I didn't. What was the point? Still, his words lingered. Was I tearing the family apart? Or was I just refusing to hold it together at my own expense? As I wrestled with those questions, an unexpected opportunity arose. A nonprofit organization in my city was hosting a charity auction, and they needed artists to donate pieces. I hesitated at first. I hadn't shown my work publicly in years, and the idea of putting myself out there was terrifying. But something about it felt right. I spent weeks working on a painting for the auction, pouring all my conflicted emotions into the canvas. It wasn't just about the family drama. It was about reclaiming a part of myself that I had buried for too long. The night of the auction, as I stood in the crowded gallery watching people admire my work, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not the hollow kind that came from seeking my family's approval, but a quiet, steady pride that came from within. Of course, the family drama was far from over. As I left the gallery that night, my phone buzzed with another text from Jake. "We need to talk," it said. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. But instead of answering, I slipped my phone back into my pocket and walked into the night, the city lights stretching endlessly ahead of me. A few days after the charity auction, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated before answering, half expecting it to be another distant relative who had somehow caught wind of my financial situation. Instead, the voice on the other end was warm and professional. "Hi, this is Sarah from the local arts council," the woman said. "We saw your piece at the auction last week, and we were blown away. We'd love to feature your work in an upcoming community exhibit." I was stunned. My painting, the one I had almost been too scared to submit, had caught someone's attention. For years, my art had been little more than a private outlet, something I did for myself in the quiet moments when no one was looking. The idea of sharing it on a larger scale was both thrilling and terrifying. "I'd love to," I said, my voice trembling slightly. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. I threw myself into painting with a focus I hadn't felt in years. Each stroke of the brush felt like a reclamation of something I had lost: my voice, my confidence, my sense of self. It was liberating to create without worrying about whether it would be good enough by someone else's standards. But the peace I found in my art was constantly interrupted by the ongoing family drama. Jake's text messages had become more frequent and increasingly aggressive. One night, after a particularly long day in the studio, I came home to find him waiting outside my apartment building. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "We need to talk," he said, his jaw tight. I didn't invite him inside. Instead, we stood on the sidewalk, the streetlights casting long shadows between us. "This has gone on long enough," he said. "You're acting like we're strangers. We're family, for God's sake." I crossed my arms. "Family doesn't mean you get to demand things from me, Jake. It doesn't mean you get to show up unannounced and make me feel guilty for living my life." He scoffed. "Living your life? You're hoarding millions while mom and dad are struggling to keep the house. Do you even care about anyone but yourself?" His words stung, but I refused to let him see it. "I've spent my entire life putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own," I said. "This is the first time I've had the chance to focus on what I want. If that makes me selfish, so be it." Jake's expression hardened. "You'll regret this," he said before turning and walking away. The encounter left me shaken, but it also strengthened my resolve. I wasn't going to let guilt or manipulation dictate my decisions anymore. A few days later, Emma called. Unlike Jake, she had been making an effort to repair our relationship, and our conversations had become a rare bright spot in the chaos. This time, though, her voice was heavy with concern. "I think Mom and Dad are planning something," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "They've been talking about hiring a lawyer," she said. "Something about what's fair and how you're obligated to help because you're part of the family." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The idea that my own parents, would go so far as to try to force me to share my money was almost too much to comprehend. "Do you think they're serious?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emma hesitated. "I don't know, but I thought you should know, just in case." I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. Could they really do something like that? I didn't know much about the legal system, but the idea of being dragged into a courtroom by my own family was horrifying. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying every argument, every accusation, every hurtful word they had thrown at me since they found out about the money. By morning, I had made a decision. I needed to protect myself. I met with a lawyer later that week, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Karen, who immediately put me at ease. She listened carefully as I explained the situation, nodding thoughtfully. "Legally, they don't have a leg to stand on," she said. "The money is yours, and there's no law that says you're obligated to share it just because you're related. But if they're determined to make trouble, it's better to be prepared." She helped me set up a trust, locking down my assets in a way that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to challenge. It was a relief to know I was taking steps to protect myself, but it also felt like a tragic milestone. The fact that I even had to consider this kind of defense against my own family was a stark reminder of how far things had spiraled. As the exhibit approached, I threw myself even deeper into my art. It became a refuge, a way to channel all the conflicting emotions I was grappling with. Each painting felt like a piece of my story, a way to express the things I couldn't put into words. The night of the exhibit was a whirlwind. The gallery was packed, the walls lined with pieces from artists across the city. Seeing my work displayed alongside theirs was surreal, like stepping into a dream I hadn't even realized I'd been chasing. Toward the end of the evening, a woman approached me. She introduced herself as a curator from a larger gallery in a neighboring city. "Your work is incredible," she said. "I'd love to feature it in an upcoming show." The offer was exhilarating, but it also felt bittersweet. As much as I wanted to celebrate this new opportunity, the shadow of my family's resentment loomed large. After the exhibit, I found myself wandering the city streets, lost in thought. The lights blurred together as I replayed the events of the past few months in my mind. Winning the lottery had given me freedom, but it had also revealed just how conditional my family's love had always been. I didn't have answers yet, and maybe I wouldn't for a long time. But as I stood there under the glow of the streetlights, I felt a quiet determination settle over me. This wasn't the end of the story, just another chapter in a journey I was finally writing for myself. The decision to focus on my art and distance myself from my family wasn't easy, but as the weeks turned into months, it began to feel like the right one. The gallery exhibit had opened doors I hadn't even known existed. Invitations to collaborate, offers to feature my work in other shows, and even inquiries from private collectors started pouring in. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was stepping into a version of myself I'd only dreamed about. But even as my art career blossomed, the unresolved tension with my family lingered like a weight on my chest. Emma had continued to reach out sporadically, offering small olive branches in the form of casual conversations and genuine attempts to rebuild our relationship. Jake, on the other hand, had gone radio silent after our last confrontation, and my parents, well, their silence was the loudest of all. One evening, as I was finishing a piece for an upcoming show, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Family meeting this weekend. Mom and Dad want to talk. I think you should come." I stared at the message for a long time, torn between curiosity and dread. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep the distance I had worked so hard to establish. But another part of me, the part that still craved closure, knew I couldn't move on completely without facing them one last time. The following Saturday, I arrived at my parents' house for the first time in months. The air felt heavy as I walked up the driveway, memories of countless childhood afternoons spent here flooding my mind. When I stepped inside, the atmosphere was tense. My mom sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. My dad stood by the window, staring out as if avoiding eye contact would somehow make this easier. Emma and Jake were already there, seated on opposite ends of the room like opposing forces in a silent war. I took a deep breath and sat down. "You wanted to talk," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. My mom was the first to speak. "We've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," she began, her voice trembling slightly. and we've realized that we might have made mistakes. I raised an eyebrow. Might have. She flinched, but my dad cut in before she could respond. What your mother is trying to say, he said, his tone measured, is that we've been unfair to you. We didn't handle things the right way, and for that, we're sorry. The apology caught me off guard. For so long, I had imagined this moment, rehearsed what I would say if they ever admitted their faults. But now that it was happening, I found myself at a loss for words. I appreciate that, I said finally, but an apology doesn't erase everything that's happened. It doesn't change the way you treated me for years, or how quick you were to turn on me the moment I didn't give you what you wanted. My mom's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about hurting them, it was about being honest. Emma spoke up then, her voice quiet but steady. I think we've all been holding on to a lot of resentment, she said, and it's poisoned the way we see each other. But if we're ever going to move forward, we need to let go of that. All of us. Jake let out a bitter laugh. Easy for you to say, you're not the one who got shut out. I turned to him, my patience wearing thin. I didn't shut you out, Jake. You decided I owed you something just because I had money. You couldn't see me as anything other than a bank account. Because you never gave me a chance, he snapped. You wrote us off the second you won. The room fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, quietly, I said, maybe I did. But can you honestly say I didn't have a reason to? Jake looked away, his jaw clenched. My mom reached for his hand, but he pulled away, standing abruptly. I can't do this, he muttered before walking out of the room. The door slammed behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. My dad sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. This isn't how I wanted this to go, he said. Maybe it's what needed to happen, I replied. We talked for a while longer, carefully navigating the minefield of our shared history. My parents acknowledged the favoritism they had shown toward Emma and Jake, though they struggled to fully understand the impact it had on me. I explained how their actions had made me feel, and for the first time, I felt like they were actually listening. By the time I left, there was no grand reconciliation, no tearful group hug, but there was a sense of understanding, fragile but real. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, I kept my distance, giving everyone space to process. Jake didn't reach out, and I decided not to chase after him. If he wanted to repair our relationship, that would have to come from him. Emma, on the other hand, became a constant presence in my life. We started meeting for coffee, sharing pieces of our lives in a way we never had before. As for my parents, our relationship remained complicated. They made efforts to include me in family events, and while I appreciated the gesture, I didn't rush to fall back into old patterns. I needed time to rebuild trust, to see if their actions matched their words. One day, while sitting in my studio, I realized something that felt like a breakthrough. I didn't need their approval anymore. For so long, I had been chasing validation, trying to prove that I was worthy of their love and attention. But now, I understood that my worth didn't come from them or anyone else. It came from me. The lottery had changed my life in ways I hadn't expected. Yes, it had brought challenges, but it had also given me the freedom to choose myself for the first time. It had shown me who I could be when I wasn't weighed down by guilt or obligation. As I finished my latest painting, a sense of peace washed over me. This was my life, my story, and for the first time, I felt truly free to write it however I wanted.